With the newest episode of Star Wars in theaters right now, it seems like everybody's got Star Wars on the brain, and I thought now would be the perfect time to go back and revisit the making of my steampunk-inspired Queen Amidala costume. I designed this costume for the 2014 Steampunk Empire Symposium, which happened to have a Star Wars theme. Now, I'll admit that this actually threw me for a loop. I've always considered Star Wars to be like one of the missing colors of my nerd palette, and so I went into this not really knowing much about the whole franchise and having to kind of start from scratch. Luckily, I love a challenge, and I love being able to come up with creative solutions to any problems that I might encounter, and I do remember there being quite a few. Now, it's been 2 years since I made this, so watching this footage is actually bringing back a lot of memories, and I will try to throw out as many tidbits about the process as I remember them. So I did start with episode 1, and I know everybody has a different opinion about the best way to approach watching the series, but I had already seen episode 1, and I remembered the Queen Amidala character, her insane, constantly changing, beautiful costumes that drew from all sorts of historical and cultural concepts, and I just thought, you know what, this is the character that I'm going to do. I just knew that from the beginning. So I started with episode 1, and then once she was out of the picture, spoiler alert, but yeah, so once she was out of the picture, I just let the rest of the story play through to provide inspiration while I finished up. I will admit though, this did take a very long time, and it's hard for me to binge watch something for too long, so I may have taken a break from the Star Wars and watched a few episodes of Bob's Burgers and Downton Abbey. Not sure if that influenced my design at all. So for me, the most important part was nailing that beautiful red color. Even when you're reinterpreting a costume, you still want to pay homage to the original, and you want people to understand who you are. So I found this red coat, I believe it was a choir robe actually, and a skirt that happened to match exactly, even though they did not go together. I got them at an estate sale for pennies. I then went to my local fabric stores and bought up a bunch of red and gold trims, anything that I thought might work. Then I just started to kind of throw things onto my dress form. Now, the original costume has a solid fur trim around the hem and a series of vertical lines like boning channels, and this was my first big change. I eliminated the channels and cut faux fur into segments. This is going to highlight something else that I will do later on, and also that faux fur would have been terrible to work with cutting it into strips. I also added a little bit of fur to the bottom of the skirt and put in a center panel with brocade. Now she's wearing a sort of tabard that features beautiful gold embroidery and fur trim, and the shoulder piece appears to be quilted. There's a series of really intricate lines along the shoulders. I recreated that with appliques because I am not an embroiderer, and I actually cut the appliques and rearranged them so they wouldn't be quite so uniform. I found this really pretty piece of very expensive trim for the bodice, and by using 2 different colors of paint layered on top of each other, I was able to get the brightness and the gold shimmer very similar to the original costume. Unfortunately, it now clashed with another piece of gold trim I was going to use, so I came up with the last minute idea to just run it behind the part you see there, letting it peek out from behind the painted trim. I then popped on some Swarovski crystals and sewed on a few red beads for that ornate Victorian look. Also, to make it look more Victorian, I added puffed sleeves to the coat. Absolutely, the biggest challenge was figuring out how I would reinterpret that ornate headpiece in a way that read as Victorian, but still kept that kind of grandiose otherworldliness. I got very lucky and found a hat at Flower Factory for, I believe, $8. It did need to be painted, but it had a really great wire border around the edge that I could manipulate, and you see there I bent it into a point. I did end up having to paint it several times to get the color consistent, which is why it looks kind of splotchy there. And I pretty much just took all the leftover pieces of trim, anything I didn't use anywhere else, anything I had that was red or gold, and just started to kind of make it up as I went along. I did want to make sure to have that giant red gem hanging in the center of my forehead. I felt like that was one of those iconic touches from the original that I didn't want to ignore. I just started cutting pieces of wire, and I suddenly had this image of these really pretty glass beads that I had sort of floating like they were suspended over the edge of the hat. So I made sure to twist the wire that way it would be strong enough to keep the beads standing up on their own. And I repeated this many, 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 many times. This gold fringe was a lucky get. The lady in line in front of me just put it down and was like, I don't want this anymore. And I was like, I do. I only had a tiny bit, so I had to kind of strategically pick where to start it and stop it on the hat. And at the very end, I just did something special with the glass beads to make it look really deliberate that that's where the gold trim was meant to end. Next, I went about recreating the 6 sane jewels along the bottom of the gown. Now, these jewels were described, according to Wikipedia, as self-illuminating, I think by means of plasma. I ended up finding a set of Christmas ornaments that happened to contain LED lights, and they were self-illuminating. I liked that the globes looked like glass and appeared to contain plasma, which was a big discovery in the Victorian era, so it worked out perfectly. I didn't necessarily love the bright blue of the light, and so I tried to give it more of a warm glow by first covering it in a layer of gold lace and then painting some fishnet with a brown and gold mix to just warm it up a little bit and also make it look like it's being contained almost by some sort of wire netting. I felt like it just brought it a little bit more in line with the steampunk aesthetic. The reason why I glued it onto these cardboard cards that you see is because at some point this coat is going to have to be washed. And so, as tempting as it would be to just glue these balls directly onto the coat, I needed a way to make them removable. Also, I wanted to have access to the back of the globe because the battery at some point might need to be replaced. Now, my globes were very round, and the stones on Amidala's gown are oblong, and for some reason, it just felt like too much of a departure from the original design, and so I wanted to kind of bring it back to that look, and came up with sort of an odd idea, and this was another one of those ideas that just kind of popped into my head fully formed. I used plastic water bottles to create these sort of casings for the globes by essentially paper macheing them with, I believe it was wrapping paper, or it may have been some sort of packaging paper that just came in a box of something that I ordered. I paper macheed that on and just brushed it with a little bit of gold paint, and it sort of created this like organic sack look. It's really, really hard to describe. It's actually just easier to watch it. So once the globes and the casings were made, I had to go about figuring out how to attach them to the coat in a way that did the least amount of damage. And I'll say cutting into this coat was terrifying. So the first thing I did was I actually cut the hole in the outer lining and then glued it to the inner lining and let it dry before cutting the hole in the inner lining. And I just wanted to make sure that I had the strongest edge, since I was going to be popping the globes in and out of it a lot. Okay, moment of truth. I've cut the holes in my coat. That was the scariest part. Even though I got this coat for a steal, I was uncomfortable with the idea of cutting into it because I might want to use it for something else in the future. This costume I'm making is so specific that... So I figured out a way to attach the... I can't remember if they're stones or eggs, but they were some sort of an organic material that had like a bioluminescent quality. And so I'm replicating that with my Christmas ornaments. They are LED lights and they have a glow to them that's a little bit more silvery than what I wanted, but with this covering, and I may even add a little bit of gold craft glass paint to kind of dull out the tone and make it more of the type of light that you would see from an antique lamp. Kind of makes me think of one of those bird nests. I think they're from China, where they lick the walls until they make a nest. The bird kind of licks like this, and eventually it dries up and it creates a nest. And then they take it down from the walls and they melt it into a soup, which is, I guess, supposed to be healthy or something. I don't know. But yeah, there we go. I've kind of given a little adornment here. And if I can find it, I cut a piece of the fur and it fits perfectly around here, just to kind of give it more texture and to make it tie in with the rest of the coat. I think that's actually a pretty cool... I wouldn't call it Victorian necessarily, but it has that biomechanical juxtaposition that the original costume has. And since I'm being challenged with the whole Star Wars theme, I don't feel that obligated to be as authentically steampunk as I would normally be. So here it is. It's an LED light. I don't care. It's painted. Don't care. There's plastic. Don't care. Because it looks cool. Yay me. Being able to approach this costume from a steampunk perspective really helped with my initial nervousness about tackling a design in a world that I just wasn't that familiar with. Here I am attempting to, and I believe failing at, shoving a hoop in the hem of the skirt. I remember having to do some major surgery to get that thing in there, which mimics the original design and is a little nod to the Victorian hoop skirt. For the makeup, I wasn't going to do the porcelain face with the little red dots on the cheeks, but I did find these nose-pinching glasses that I already had. I spray painted them gold and added 2 red jewels to the bottom, which just happened to fall on my cheeks. So again, a little wink and nod to the original design. I believe I made those beaded tassels out of something else and just added them at the last minute to give that back a little bit more visual interest, a little more texture, since it was all the same color. I finished it off with some really cheap jewelry that I found. And here I am at Symposium, waiting in the hall for the costume contest to start. There were multiple categories, men's, women's, and a group one, and I ended up winning my category, which was awesome, and it just felt really good after all of that work. It was amazing to see the other contestants, their interpretations of the theme, and just to be surrounded by all that creativity. It's one of my favorite things about doing this. And there it is, the answer to my Steampunk meets Star Wars challenge. I hope that you enjoyed watching this video and that it inspires you in whatever project that you happen to be working on. And here's a picture of me standing in front of a TARDIS, because why not confuse things even further? I hope you enjoyed this. Bye.